You're listening to another ambitious entrepreneurnetwork.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
Welcome to Industry Thought Leader Podcast. Stand out, be heard, influence. Want to influence real change with your message while become known as an authority in your field? Industry Thought Leader Podcast will show you how. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
And welcome to another episode of Industry Thought Leader Podcast, brought to you by Industry Thought Leader Academy. Stand out, be heard, and influence. Yes, I'm your host, Anne-Marie Cross, also known as the Podcasting Queen. Now, my guest today says imposter syndrome isn't just an interesting self-help topic. Imposter syndrome has real costs to individuals and their organizations. And joining me on today's show is Dr. Valerie Young. Valerie, she is an internationally recognized expert on imposter syndrome. She's the author of The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women with Random House, now in 6 languages. She's also a speaker and has spoken at organizations such as Successful Women, Google, Facebook, Boeing, BP, NASA, Merck, IBM, Society of Women Engineers, and 100 plus universities, including Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. And she has been an entrepreneur for 25 years, so know what it's like to run a business. Now, on today's show, she is going to share why imposter syndrome, it isn't just a fancy term for low self-esteem. She's going to talk about the high cost of imposter syndrome to entrepreneurs and their companies. And if you're working with an organization and if you recognize imposter syndrome, maybe you're a leader of teams, this is important, as well as 3 immediately useful, usable solutions. So let's dive in. Welcome to the show, Valerie.
I'm really excited to be here, Anne-Marie.
This is a topic that I know many people talk about and have experienced. So tell me, what was it that led you to becoming an expert and wanting to really speak into this area of imposter syndrome? What was your journey?
I can't say that my goal was to become an expert in imposter syndrome. I was a graduate student studying for my doctorate. Somebody brought in a paper by Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. Those are the 2 psychologists who coined the term the imposter phenomenon, as it really is more accurately known in the world of psychology. It's not a medically, psychologically diagnosable syndrome, but it just got called that somehow over the years. But she brought in this paper and started describing how all these bright, capable people felt like they were fooling other folks and they were going to be found out. And I instantly identified, I just nodding my head like a bobblehead doll. I became so interested, Anne-Marie, that I decided to change the whole focus of my doctoral work at the time and look at more broadly women's self-limiting attitudes and behaviors. At the time, their paper was called The Imposter Phenomenon Amongst High-Achieving Women. The thinking was this primarily impacted women. Very quickly determined that there are a lot of men who also have these feelings. So it wasn't so much studying the imposter syndrome, but rather what are the variables that would lead us to have these feelings?
Yes, incredible. And as you said, you recognize that it wasn't just women, also men. And I would imagine too, in your studies and through the years, you've recognized that even through different, even generations and different cultures, I think everyone experiences this, don't they? This phenomenon of not feeling good enough, I'm going to be found out.
Absolutely. It's very widespread. And actually, it's counterintuitive, Anne-Marie, but the more successful you are, you just feel like you're fooling more people on a higher level.
Yes.
So success doesn't make it better. It can make it scarier.
And it's interesting that, and I love why we're having this conversation, because often people will think, well, when I'm this and this, when I have this degree, or when I have this qualifications, or get to this level in my career. And I remember years ago in my career practice, I was interview coaching this high-level CEO who was going to become oversee, multiple hospitals around the globe. And his experience was incredible. And he said, look, just between you and I said, I don't think I'm going to get this. I don't know why they've asked me to speak. And yet his resume, which I had in front of me, just, bullet point after bullet point
Right.
of, success. And so, yeah, everyone can relate to this. And the higher you go, the more often that we will feel that pressure.
Right.
Let's talk about, imposter syndrome. We've heard that. You've mentioned actually the coin was termed in not imposter syndrome, but rather a phenomenon. It isn't just a fancy word for low self-esteem. What are some things that you've identified?
Well, imposter syndrome describes this experience whereby, despite achievement, accolades, as you said, resume, that we have this secret belief that we're going to be found out. So people who feel like imposters have become very adept at saying, well, sure, I'm successful, or sure, I did it, but I can explain all that. So we dismiss our accomplishments. We chalk them up to things like I could imagine, your hospital administrator would say, well, I just look good on paper. Or if I can do it, anybody can, right? How hard can it be? Or luck or timing, or this sense that, yeah, they said my presentation was great, but that's just because they like me. So we kind of externalize our successes and then live in this fear that, eventually we're going to be found out. So, and how it differs from self-esteem. And let me be clear, there are some studies that have connected the two. Other studies find no connection. So in other words, it's possible to have healthy self-esteem and still have imposter feelings. So self-esteem is more of a kind of a global feeling we have about ourselves or sense about ourselves. But imposter feelings are very specific to achievement arenas: work, school, business. You don't feel like an imposter when you're walking the dog or emptying the dishwasher. But you might in a high-level meeting or a job interview, or you're being challenged on your work, or you're getting critical feedback, those kinds of things.
Yes. I love the way that you've were able to distinguish that, because it's so true. And something that I have often heard too, and this is going back to that hospital administrator, was, well, I'm only as good as my team, but they didn't recognize that they were such great leaders. They brought the out of their team. Isn't it interesting that no matter how much experience that we get, and for many of us, we're just doing what we love doing, and recognizing our gifts and our strengths and our talents, and then using that with excellence so that everyone around us and can certainly thrive as well. What is it about that maybe with all of that experience, there can still be that level of doubt? Is it often comparison around what other people are doing? Is it because many of us are driven for excellence and integrity and so forth, that when we see what other people are doing, that can often be, well, because we set our bar so high? What has that come as part of the conversation, that comparison?
Comparison certainly can, is in the mix. Especially now with social media, there's so many more opportunities, and surely we can't all be living our best life at the same time, but that's, of course, how it appears to others. But you're absolutely right, Anne-Marie, that people who feel like imposters have set the internal bar so unrealistically and unsustainably high that no human on the planet could consistently hit it, right? We have these very exaggerated, unrealistic notions about what it means to be competent. So even though no one likes to fail, no one likes to have an off day, a bad podcast, nobody likes to have to ask for help or struggle to master something. When those things happen to those of us with imposter feelings, we experience shame. And the reason we feel shame is because we feel like, if I was really all that good, whatever that might be, then those things shouldn't happen.
Yeah. I love this conversation. It's so true. And often, it doesn't matter how much experience you have. You look at something, you think, you think, stop it, and you have to remind yourself. I've often said to some of my clients, you need to write down a list of all of those things. Write down the feedback that you've gotten for people. And so if you're not internally validating what you've got, there's a fine line between self-confidence and arrogance, but remind yourself of what other people say. That's so very important. Recognizing what are some of the things that would have me feel less than, and remind myself of what I have done and achieved.
Well, can I add to that assignment that you give people?
Please.
Because often we have people kind of write down their accomplishments and review it, and that, I think, it's useful. But I know I have a doctorate. I know the things I've done.
Yeah.
When you feel like an imposter, though, we tend to downplay them. And here's the thing: maybe you were lucky.
Yeah.
Maybe you were in the right place at the right time. Maybe you do have a great personality and that's what they're responding to, or you had a great connection. Those are all legitimate variables in everybody's success at one time or another. But imposters don't realize is that they are legitimate. And so, yeah, make a list and go, yeah, maybe I was in the right place at the right time, but you're the one who followed through, right? That you yes, maybe you have a great personality, but guess what? That's a skill set.
Yes.
Right? We dismiss it like, oh, they just like me, as if likability wasn't a skill set. It's an incredibly powerful skill set, especially in leadership.
Yeah. And I love that you've said that, because often what we take for granted is what other people admire in us. Sometimes even be on time for meetings and organized. For someone who is disorganized and often running late, that is something that they long to achieve or long to be. And I love that you've reminded us that don't just have a flippant conversation to yourself, well, that's anyone can do it. Actually not. And I love what Emin has said here. I'm such a fraud. That's what what you were talking about earlier, Dr. Valerie. Let's talk about the high cost of imposter syndrome to entrepreneurs in their company. I mean, we've already touched the surface. If we continue to say that to ourselves, or anyone can do that, we're really continuing to speak negatively over ourselves. But what are some of the high costs that you've seen?
Well, it comes down to the fact, Anne-Marie, that there are behaviors associated with imposter syndrome. It's not just a feeling. It manifests itself in different, what Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes would call, different coping and protecting mechanisms. And I've added some to their original list. So that's things like, I refer to it as kind of flying under the radar. So that might be the person who doesn't speak up in meetings, doesn't ask questions, doesn't share ideas, doesn't go for more challenging opportunity, doesn't scale their business. Because a sense of, if I can kind of just play small, keep my head down, stay down here, no one can judge me. I won't be humiliated. I'll be less likely to fail. For others, it might be procrastination. So if you wait until the very last minute, and then your results really show that, right? You don't get the contract, right? Because you just whipped it off the day before. Then you have kind of a built-in excuse. You can say, well, I'm disappointed, but I'm hardly surprised, because I know it didn't reflect my best effort. But the rub is, if you did land the contract, then you wouldn't feel deserving, because you would feel like, fooled them again. If they only knew I just did it at the last minute. Sadly, for some people, that turns into never starting or finishing the project, the business proposal, the business plan, whatever that might be, or they never just start their business. Or it could be self-sabotage, could be alcohol or substance abuse. I met a woman once who had her first client, and she gave the person the wrong directions twice in a row. And she suddenly realized she was unconsciously trying to sabotage because she was so anxious about it. And the last one, which entrepreneurs are famous for, is overworking and over-preparing. And I don't mean good old-fashioned hard work, because entrepreneurs, as you know, work harder than anybody else. What does Lori Grenier say? Entrepreneurs are the only people she knows who are willing to put in 80 hours a week for themselves to avoid working 40 hours a week for someone else. Right? So I don't mean good old-fashioned hard work, but the sense that if I give up for let go for a second, it's all going to fall apart, because we think the only reason I'm successful is because I'm kind of outrunning the no talent police, and I'm working so darn hard.
Yes.
So all of those, here's the good news. They do the job. They protect us. They help us avoid disappointment, humiliation, embarrassment. They help protect us from failure or scrutiny, perhaps. They get us, hey, guess what? If you procrastinate, you get time to do stuff you'd rather do. Right? So they help us avoid, protect, or get something, but always at a cost. We pay a cost for the protection that we get. So we want to step back and go, well, what would happen if I never change this pattern? What price will I pay? What opportunities and experiences will I miss out on? And again, not just for you, but what are the costs to your organization as well?
And you often will hear that people who are working to the point where they just run themselves into the ground, and often your body will take control and say, and you get sick. You've heard of, and that often requires them to take a step back and relook at, well, what am I doing? It's not serving me. This is something that Aman has said here. The way I see it is that people are just easily impressed by just faking it. Am I real? No, I'm just good at faking it. It's interesting that the beliefs that we tell ourselves, isn't it? I mean, first of all, is it recognizing the things that we're saying to ourselves and what driving us, the motives? Because I think that if we're overworking because we think that this is the only way that I'm going to be able to build a successful business, versus I know I'm going to put some extra hours into this proposal because this proposal is something that I've had my heart set on, and it's going to give me the best opportunity to position myself, as winning that contract. That motive and what we're telling ourselves and what's driving us is important, isn't it? Is it positive or is it negative? I'd love you to speak a little bit about this.
Well, it is. There's this lovely woman up in British Columbia in Canada, Cybele Negris. She started the first domain registration company in Canada. She co-founded that with a few other people. When she was in her 20s, she had one of the most successful commercial real estate companies. She was this extreme achiever, but she was doing it on like 3 hours sleep a night. The cleaning staff would find her sleeping in her office in the morning, and she got a bleeding ulcer before she was 30. And she realized at that point that it was imposter feelings that was driving her to work, those kind of crazy, insane kinds of hours. So yeah, I think we have to be mindful, and I think most of us can kind of parse out, because again, when you work for yourself, when you're an entrepreneur, you signed up to work really hard, but you're building something, right? It's yours, so it feels very different. But that's different than I'm doing this because I don't know, what they're going to find out. Now, the question came up there on the screen about, I'm just good at faking it. Well, what does that mean? Because winging it is also a skill set. Sometimes we all have to go kind of seat of our pants, right? Kind of jump in and figure it out. One of my entrepreneur friends, his quote was, half-ass is better than no ass. Right? It's like, so sometimes, years ago, let me give you a quick example. I was asked by I just started out doing this other business I had. And I was asked, I did a press release to this big magazine, and they said, well, we're not interested in that, but could you write a column, these list of tips on the side on this other topic? I knew nothing about it, but I said, sure. It's like, how hard could it be, right? I'll figure it out. So winging it is also a skill set, as is the ability to project confidence when we don't always necessarily feel confidence, which is different than arrogance.
Yeah. I mean, how often, and I'm sure we'd all relate to this, you're going to speak about a topic, maybe a topic that you've spoken about for many, many, many years, and yet there's always those butterflies. There's always that concern, well, it's not that we're faking it or anything like that. There are just other things that are going on. We want to make it the best, but it's that debilitating, isn't it? That where is it coming on? What's driving you? And is it debilitating? Because at the end of the day, no matter what you are achieving, if you're constantly looking out for things that are going wrong or evidence that proves, hey, I'm a fake, guess what? If you're seeking that evidence, you are going to find it, even if that's sabotage. We will create environments that will that will prove our beliefs are true. So such a valuable conversation.
There's no joy. There's only relief, that I fooled them. And you don't get to experience joy at the satisfaction of win, lose, you did your best.
Yeah, but what a life-changing awareness would it be, or to gain awareness that, hang on a second, one of your gifts and your skill sets is to wing it. And then, because then you can step forward and use it intentionally, isn't it? Because as you say, entrepreneurship, different projects, in some instances, there is a level of risk, and in some, huge risk. And so if we're not recognizing that, hang on a minute, I actually do this well, let that drive you forward. I would love to hear these immediately useful solutions, 3 of them. What are they?
Well, the first one, Emery, is to normalize imposter feelings. And we do that a few ways. One is by looking at the perfectly good reasons why you might feel like a fraud. So if we know, for example, if you were raised by humans, you have a far better chance of having imposter feelings than if you weren't, right? Because there's some messages we might have gotten growing up that made us become perfectionists or what have you. So that said, there's also situational factors. It's no coincidence that I speak at so many universities, because students, especially graduate students getting advanced degrees, are much more likely to feel like imposters. People who work alone, who are solopreneurs, self-employed, or now so many people are working remotely because of COVID. That isolation can also get in our head. We don't have people to bounce things off of. Certain organizational cultures can fuel self-doubt. Universities, you're surrounded by very highly educated people. Medical education with a lot of shaming going on if you don't know something. And people in certain fields are more susceptible. People in creative fields, actors, writers, artists, as are people in STEM fields. So I think we need to look at the different variables. And I want to add to that a sense of belonging fosters confidence. So when you walk into a meeting or a workplace or the executive level in any organization, the more people who look like you or maybe sound like you, let's say you have a strong regional accent that people can identify as kind of a working class kind of accent, or English is not your first language, or whatever language they're speaking there, it's not your first language. The more people who look or sound like us, the more confident we feel, and the opposite can be true. So it's not surprising when I've spoken all over the world at universities, no matter where I am, the biggest group to show up are the international students, because they've got the same challenges everyone else has, but they're doing it in another culture and probably in a second or third language. If you're the first generation in your family to go to university or to have a white collar job or become a financial success, you're more likely. Women, racial minorities, people of color, people with disabilities. In other words, any group for whom there are stereotypes about competence or intellect make you more susceptible. And we all know what that's like on one degree or another. We've all been like the youngest person in a situation and felt like we're being underestimated because we're young, or maybe we're on the other end of that continuum, right? We're the oldest person. So I want people to contextualize and do less personalizing, less psychologizing, and more contextualizing. So when you have a normal imposter moment, Amber, you step back and go, well, why wouldn't I feel this way? I'm sitting in this meeting with all these bankers and I'm the only woman in the room, for example. The other way we normalize it is to realize that up to 70% of people have these feelings at one time or another, which means we are in the majority. Like, what's up with the other 30, right? Why aren't we studying them? Now, some part of that other 30 has a whole different issue going on, like irrational self-confidence syndrome. Their sense of their competence far exceeds their actual competence.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? That's something that's not often spoken about.
It's actually been studied. There's a name, it's called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And Professor Dunning at Cornell University found that consistently the students who are the most kind of arrogant about their outcome, like, oh, I aced it, I nailed that exam, the smartest guy in the room, they do the worst. The student who is convinced I'm going to fail, I'm going to bomb, it's going to be terrible, they always perform the best. So in other words, people who don't know what they don't know that they don't know. But there's some part of that 30%, I think, Anne-Marie, that we can learn from because they think differently. Because, what everybody wants is to stop feeling like an imposter, but that's not how it works. Feelings are the last to change. People who don't feel like imposters are no more intelligent, capable, competent, qualified than the rest of us. It's just in the exact same situation that triggers an imposter feeling in me and us. They are thinking different thoughts, which is good news because we can learn to think like them. So in other words, my mantra is the only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking about like an imposter. And that's the second strategy, is to reframe. In other words, to become consciously aware. What is the conversation going on in your head when you're having a normal imposter moment? And then step back and think of like what would be like a more realistic way to look at it, a way that somebody who doesn't feel like an imposter might look at the situation. So for example, constructive criticism. When you feel like an imposter, it wounds you, right? It just cuts to our soul, right? Because it validates, see, I'm not deserving, or I'm not smart, or whatever it might be. People who don't feel like imposters, they see constructive criticism as a gift. They seek it out. They hire coaches to give them information they need to continually get better. I can always tell the difference between a business owner and an entrepreneur. Because in my mind, if you give somebody feedback, like, gee, have you thought about doing this in your business, right? With your shop, if you put the sign in the window, that might help as people are walking by. If they're very dismissive and they don't really want advice, I think, yeah, they're a business owner. Entrepreneur is like, thank you so much for telling me how I can make, from a customer's perspective, how I can be better.
Yeah.
But people who don't feel like imposters think differently about competence. They think differently about failure, mistakes, and criticism, and they think differently about fear. So if we can understand how they think about those things and then start integrating those and reframing them, it'll go a huge way.
Yeah.
And the last one, do you want me to go through all of them, or do you want to stop and chat?
Please.
Okay. The last one is, I always ask my audiences, how many of you would love to feel confident 24/7? Most people raise their hand. My response is always, good luck with that, right? Because that's not how it works. That's what you were saying before about having the jitters. We have moments of fear. We have moments of confidence. We have moments of self-doubt. And that is real life. And it doesn't mean you're not competent. See, we've conflated competence and confidence.
Yes.
We think if I was really competent, I'd feel confident all the time. And if you feel confident all the time, I'm scared for you because something's missing there. Because there's times when it is scary to walk into a new situation where you've never done before, and you are kind of winging it a little bit, right? So instead of leaning into the fear, I always recommend people remind themselves that your body doesn't know the difference between fear and excitement. Right. So just to remind yourself, just keep telling yourself, I'm excited. I'm excited. Yeah. So the last one is to keep going regardless of how you feel.
Yes.
Right. Keep going regardless of how you feel. Don't wait until you feel confident to scale your business. Don't wait until you feel 100% ready and confident to raise your rates. Yeah. Right. Do the thing, change your thoughts, then change your behaviors. And over time, the feelings will catch up.
Yeah. I mean, just in everything that you shared, there's just so much we can unpack. But one of the things that I'd love to just focus on, and this is something that I think it's such a valuable lesson, and that is the constructive criticism. Because if we look at it from the point of, more from a negative, well, they're judging me, we're losing on opportunities where we can grow. But one thing too that I have learned over the years as well is to also reflect, well, who is it that's sharing that? Are they a mentor? Are they someone who has, incredible value to offer? Or is it someone that, the constructive criticism from someone who is just bringing something up that does? I think we got to get to a stage where we can look at something, go, yep, I'm going to learn and grow from that. Or maybe I'm just going to park that to the side and not take it on board, because it's when we take that on board and let it really impact us negatively that it can become a real barrier. Would you say?
That's a really good point, especially with social media, and total strangers giving you all kinds of feedback that may or may not be useful to be able to kind of parse out what's useful, what's not. It's kind of like, in the Olympics, they throw out the high score and throw out the low score, right? There's probably some value in the middle there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was the Brene Brown that said, unless you're in the ring, don't bother giving me any judgments or feedback or anything like that. If you're for the external people who are just watching. I remember years ago when I first started a co-hosted podcast, we got feedback that was very, kind of critical. And initially it kind of really just pierced us in the heart. But then we took a step back and said, well, you know what? There was some real value in the response that person provided us, and then we were able to implement changes for that. Sometimes we just need to take a step back and go, okay, can I look at it through the lens of where can we grow from this? What can we learn and what can we adapt? Here, Iman is here. Constructive criticism is just more proof. If I was really good, I would have known or thought more about it. Well, you know what? Then I would go back and say, now, where did Dr. Valerie share about that? Let's gives, go through that process that we can take on board what is really helpful. What would you say to someone just in finalizing, if someone continues to really, like what Aman was saying, look at it from a negative point of view? We've got to break that cycle, don't we? Otherwise, we're just going to continue to have it negatively impact us. What would you say to someone that perhaps is continuing to have that reflect negatively?
Yeah, I think so often, and I was at a conference, and a young woman sitting next to me said when she sends an email out to her boss and higher ups, she's kind of sitting there waiting for this positive reinforcement to come back about the email. And I said, well, that's a problem because frankly, they're busy, right? They don't have time to validate your every email, right? Just kind of do your job. And if there's something, they'll mention it as you go along. But I think that we have to get over this idea that, everything we're going to do is going to be wonderful. We're not going to think of everything. We're not going to know everything. I always ask people, how many of you have been in a meeting or a class and you didn't understand, but you didn't want to raise your hand because you didn't want to look stupid? And then someone else asks your question and they go, oh, that's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
Brilliant idea, Anne-Marie. And you're like, oh, that was my question, right? So the point that I make to people is it's not about knowing everything. It's about not knowing with confidence. Yeah. It's about being the person in the room who confidently raises their hand and says, excuse me, Anne-Marie, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, or I'm not following. Do you mean this or do you mean that? Because we're all entitled to have an off day, to not understand, to be confused, to get it wrong.
Yeah.
And if we truly felt like we were entitled to all of those things, then there'll be nothing to feel like an imposter about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got Maxine here. Before we finish, I'll just said, hi there, Anne-Marie, Dr. Valerie. Love the concept of what we can learn from the feedback. I mean, yeah, me too. Once I recognize that and go from a curious mindset, don't take it personally, but what can I learn from that, and know what to adopt and adapt, and know what to go, no, that's not relevant for me. And
could I give you an example?
Oh, absolutely, please.
It was somebody who wrote, it was a opinion piece in a large newspaper in the US, who was an executive coach. And ironically, she had just delivered a talk on imposter syndrome. Came home, somebody emailed her and said, I enjoyed your talk, but I just wanted you to know you said 100 times. And she was, devastated and upset and angry, and she went through all these emotions. And then she stepped back and said, and it was an hour talk, right? She stepped back and said, then she developed a different response. And I thought she was going to say something else, but she felt was pity. She felt sorry for this young woman because she clearly didn't know that you shouldn't give unsolicited feedback and all these other reasons. She felt sorry for her. I thought she was going to say gratitude, because you're a speaker. This person not only told you said, she quantified it 100 times in 60 minutes. That's a lot of ums. She gave you, everyone else could have been thinking it. She took the time to give you this information to help you get better. You should have sent her roses.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a missed opportunity. Similarly, a beautiful example, similarly to the example where we received feedback from one of our audience members to say, look, you didn't give your guest enough time to really speak. And we learned on that, and we made sure that we gave them plenty of time. Dr. Valerie, you mentioned, I think 80%. Or is it
70% is the one that's the number often tossed around.
Can you share with us what the other phenomenon was? Because I think this speaks into possibly what you're talking about. Because Amanda said, what's the difference between imposter and a narcissist? I think, what was the other one where people are too overconfident? What was that other term that you used?
It's called the Dunning, Dunning. His name is Professor Dunning. Dunning-Kruger Effect, Kruger, which is, I assume, another professor. If you Google that, you will find it everywhere. It's been widely studied.
Yeah.
So a narcissist has they think everything they do is exceptional. They think they are the greatest at everything. They certainly can't hear, feedback or anything negative. Whereas people who feel like imposters, it's often just the opposite. They're painfully aware of their, deficits in ways that they don't always, which none of us do. That's what I want to be clear about. I want people to think about sports, right? When it's athletes or it's a sporting team, we understand intellectually somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. The losing team does not hang up their uniform and go home and quit. They go watch the game tape. They go get some more coaching. And they always say, we'll get them next time, right? So you can be crushingly disappointed if you have a bad podcast. Or let's say which I am tired right now, frankly, right? So I could easily just be stumbling all over my words. And I would be disappointed, but not ashamed. And that's the big difference. It's like if you try your best and it doesn't work out, try again next time, right? Just shake it off and move on as quickly as you possibly can.
Yeah, so true. Because then you've got that secondary negative aspect, which often will stop you, because what you're doing is telling yourself then is, well, maybe I shouldn't go and do that. But look, I have loved today's conversation. Thank you so much. I would not have said you were tired, because everything that you shared today was so brilliant, and I know is certainly going to be so helpful, especially because so many of us think that we're the only ones. Isn't that often true with anything? If we're struggling with a particular technology, and how many people have said, oh, I'm not really good at tech. Well, guess what? You and so many other people.
Right.
And then we realize, well, you know what? Let's just be curious. What can you learn? What can you learn from others? Take feedback through a lens of, well, what can I learn from this? Because let's face it, life would be so boring if we were good at everything. I mean, there would be never opportunities to learn and grow and adapt. And I think let's just embrace that we're never going to know everything, and that's good, because that keeps life interesting. What can people do to find out more about what the work that you're doing? How can they best connect with you?
It's very easy. It's impostersyndrome.com.
Yeah, fantastic. Once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that it's rather late for you, and I appreciate you taking the time out today.
It's fine. Thank you so much. I'm really glad you invited me.